Wonderful. Okay, so good evening, and thank you for allowing me a chance to speak. What I understand has been a very interesting week, and there have been a large number of webinars. And if you're not used to sitting through a large number of webinars, you're possibly a little bit fatigued at this point. So thank you very much for bearing with me and listening to my presentation. And today I am going to talk about agroforestry, which has come up, I suspect, over the course of the week, and certainly trees and woodland are reasonably high on the agenda in Wales, and it's an interesting topic and it gets people talking. So I hope I will be able to offer you my perspective on agroforestry and where I'm coming from with it, and hopefully we can have some discussion towards the end. So my presentation is going to cover basically four broad areas. I'm going to start just trying to break down what agroforestry is and maybe demystify it a little bit. I'm then going to move on and think about why now? Why are we thinking about agroforestry in Wales? What does it have to offer from my perspective? And hopefully we can hear from your perspective as well. I'm then going to talk a little bit about barriers to adoption. And I suspect that's something that we can all also discuss, because there are lots of reasons why forms of change are quite difficult. And then briefly, I will have a sort of very brief pause where I will think about the future of agroforestry in Wales, but also I'll also talk a little bit briefly beyond that. So before I start all of that, I just thought I'd have one slide here, just explaining a little bit about me. So I'm an academic. I'm a lecturer in forestry at Bangor. So that's an interesting start. I'm an unusual forester in that my primary area of research and my primary interest has always been food security. And I primarily work with farmers. So I do that both in Wales, but I also work in tropical systems and have done so for the last 20 years. So on my slide that I hope you can see here now, you can see three very different, but in some senses very similar farming landscapes. Similar because there's trees present in all of them. So in the top corner, you can see Wales and our typical upland farming landscape with a mixture of different tree cover, ranging from conifer plantations down to hedgerow systems within the farmed landscape. And then to sort of contrast that and thinking of another upland system, I've worked quite recently in Vietnam with farmers. This is a picture from the northwest of Vietnam, where, if you believe it or not, you're looking at a maize field on quite a big slope. And as you can imagine, there are quite a few challenges to farming on that slope, not least that a large portion of your soil disappears down that slope every year. But the depth of the soil there is a lot deeper than it is here, over 4 meters. So we haven't yet necessarily worked out that it's a massive problem yet, but at the same time, there's a big interest in using agroforestry to stabilize those farming systems. The final picture is a very different form of agroforestry. It's a parkland in northern Ghana. We're looking at a shea tree system. So this is the farmers grow groundnut beneath the trees, which the men harvest, and the shea tree produces a fruit, which the women harvest. The shea nut is used in soaps, but also it's a food stock, and it's when the cocoa season is struggling, they will often supplement the cocoa with shea. So you've probably had some shea in your chocolate. So I work very much with farmers in all of these contexts, primarily looking at the role that trees can play to meet food security needs. But it's not just that. I do a lot of work looking at the other benefits that trees can play, not necessarily always from the farming perspective. So looking at societal benefits from trees around flood risk and flood management. I'll touch on that very briefly later. But most of my time, I work very closely with farmers gathering their local knowledge. And I'll come back to why that's important as we go through. So that's my background. I've been doing agroforestry as a researcher for about 20 years now, all at Bangor. But I'm very lucky in that I get to travel and meet farmers everywhere. So I wanted to start with thinking a little bit about what is agroforestry. And this is a picture taken on my almost daily walk from my house. And we're just looking at a typical scene earlier this spring during the hot weather, just as lambing was occurring. And you can see in this picture that the trees are already playing a valuable role from the sheep and the lamb's perspective in this shaded environment. So I'm going to get a little bit technical now, and I'm going to provide you with a couple of definitions, and then we'll break those definitions down and think about what they might mean. But it's useful to have that picture in our head as we do it. So I mean, I can probably read this out as quickly, you can probably read it quicker than I can speak it. But I think the key thing that we want to be talking about here is when we're talking about agroforestry, the longer definition on the left is basically identifying that it's a combination of trees and crops, or trees and animals, or a mixture of trees, crops and animals, any form of that. And by trees, we're including anything from shrubs right up to big standard trees. They're not necessarily to be arranged at the same place at the same time. There are some forms of agriculture that take place in the early phases of woodland establishment. And so the agriculture is only going on in the early phases, and then it's replaced by trees. So some of these are sequences which occur in time, but most of them are looking at sequences that occur in space. But the bit that I want you to concentrate on here is that a key element of agroforestry is that it results in a significant ecological and economic interaction between the tree and the agricultural component. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. For a simpler and quicker definition, agroforestry is where trees interact with agriculture. Okay, so one of the things that we immediately can think about, if we think about what that means in relation to the picture I just showed you, is that agroforestry is already something which is very present on farming systems across Wales and has been for a very, very long time. So we're not necessarily talking about something new. And agroforestry is something that comes from farming and comes from farmers. So I talked about local knowledge. One of the reasons why I study local knowledge is to learn from farmers about the trees and their systems. Different farmers work in different ways with trees, but they often have highly detailed local knowledge about the role that the trees play in their systems. Sometimes they don't get asked about it a lot. And I suspect it'd be quite interesting to have conversations with you about the way that trees work within your systems. But the science that I've been involved with has its roots in this farming practice. And the role of science has been, and I work with the CGIAR. So if you look at the bottom there, you can see that little logo for World Agroforestry. And our remit is to work with farmers, primarily in the tropics in that context, to look at food security, working with these types of systems. So, more text. If we think about agroforestry, there are some basic principles. So it will involve at least 2 or more species of plants and animals, with at least one being a woody perennial. So that's the tree component sort of dealt with. It's always got 2 or more outputs. Those outputs aren't necessarily economic outputs. They can be ecological outputs, which indirectly lead to economic outputs. But they will often be in a form of products that feed directly into the farming system. So we can think about roles that trees have played in terms of food provision. You might be using trees in orchard systems. We can talk about the role of fiber, wood and wood fuel, or probably more relevant to us here in Wales, those trees can provide roles such as the provision of shelter or to stabilize soils, either on the banks of rivers or on steep slopes where we need to keep that resource where it can provide the most benefit to the farm, not in the stream heading off to provide benefit to somebody else's farm. Agroforestry is a long-term project, and that's both a benefit and something to think carefully about, because you need to manage them for periods of time. Putting them in the wrong place is quite an issue. But even the simplest form of agroforestry system has some degree of complexity to it. It is often ecologically complex, and that's often seen as a benefit. But it can be economically more complex than a monocropping system. Okay, and the complexity is part of the attraction of the system, but also can be a little bit off-putting when we're thinking about it for the first time. But one of the things that I really want to get across with this meeting is that it's also a very flexible concept. So it manifests in all sorts of ways on farms, in ways that sometimes maybe even the farmers aren't thinking about it. And it will present itself in very different forms depending on the manner in which you're farming, the size of your farm, etc., etc. So there's, even though I provided you with a very basic definition, it manifests in lots of different ways. So this is a slide, again, this is coming from the tropics, and this is an ICRAF slide, but I think it's helpful. And what it's showing here is a process that we're all probably aware of if we think back in time. We have seen over the last, since 9,000 years ago, I suspect at the birth of agriculture, a shift where we've cleared land, slowly cleared land, to create space for agriculture. And in that process, we've removed a lot of old growth forest, and we go through a process of deforestation to clear land for agriculture. And I suspect that in different parts of the world, we are now, if we follow that red curve there, we're starting to look at systems where we're bringing trees back into the landscape. So Geraint was talking about the National Forest for Wales. One of the objectives of that is to increase our tree cover, and it will take, hopefully and potentially, many different forms. So there's a role for plantation forestry, but hopefully there's also a role for agroforestry in those sequences. But the key thing for me, and what I wanted to get across, is that if we look at this transition over time, we see that agroforestry can occur on our land in two different ways. The first is that trees are often left on the farm because they provide some sort of role when we're clearing land. And so when I talk about farms in Wales having agroforestry on them, if I go and sit in a typical Welsh landscape, we will see trees that have been retained on farms, maybe not by the farmer at that time, but by his father or his father's father. And those trees are maintained and kept because they have a role and a function. Okay, and at the other end of the spectrum, we've got a lot of people now who are also thinking about enhancing that or introducing new agroforestry systems onto their land, so much more planned, modern, maybe agroforestry systems. And of course, there's room for both. And it may be that in many senses, we don't necessarily need to add or increase our tree cover on our farms, but just to think about how we manage it so that we make sure that it's working for us in the best way possible. And I think most farms in the UK have purposely retained trees. Certainly when I go onto a landscape, it's very rare that I'll find one without any trees at all. And for many cases, those trees have been present for a long period of time and do provide, particularly if you push, they do provide a number of interesting on-farm benefits. So I've got a couple of pictures to demonstrate that. So I guess, and this is an argument I had with some colleagues, some more forestry-related colleagues. So the first picture there in the top left-hand corner is showing a very, very simple form of agroforestry, a single tree. That's not in Wales. It's a very arty picture from Italy. And what you can see there in the evening sun is a herd of sheep staying out of that sun by clustering in the shadow of the standards that are sitting there in those fields. Okay, so that is a clear benefit that's occurring to the stock. They are getting a well-being benefit from those lone trees. It's probably not ideal from my perspective. I wouldn't like to see stock clumped like that, and I'm sure many of you would also share those concerns. So my argument here would maybe a few more of those trees to allow a little bit more options for the sheep, but it's still an example of a role that a tree can play on a farm and a reason why a tree might be maintained. Of course, if we look at the picture on the bottom right, a scene we're all more familiar with, if we look across a typical Welsh uplands landscape, we can see both plenty of sheep and plenty of trees. And they sit there across that landscape. That's very much a farmed landscape we're looking at. And you'll see trees. Obviously, we can all identify where the rivers are. So there's quite a large amount of tree cover there by the river systems. But you can see the role that the hedgerows are playing, both as boundary markers, so they're adding to the cultural value of the landscape, but indeed they're also playing a role, often providing shelter, either be it from the sun or from the rain. So at its very basic forms, these are the basic forms of agroforestry, but we can look at more complex forms. So on the left here, we have a shelter belt system. So you can see an old hedgerow, and sitting alongside that hedgerow and expanding it both vertically and horizontally. We've got a shelter belt system, and those systems are designed to primarily protect stock from difficult weather. In the top picture, you've got a different form of shelter belt system. So this is actually coming from Henvice, the Bangor University farm, where we are allowed to play with these sorts of systems. So this is looking at a clumping design. And again, we have large numbers of these clumps around farms. We were thinking about how we might create systems which are more farmer friendly. We can get machinery around that still provide some of these benefits. And indeed, if you go into this field midsummer, you'll see the sheep fully enjoying those clump designs. And if we played with them a little bit more, we could probably make them so that they were nice for producing timber, provided better shade, etc., etc. We then have more formal row systems. So you can see a picture there from Ireland where ash trees have been planted in rows amongst sheep. And in this case, this is a cropping system. So the idea is that you produce 2 crops from the land. This is that economic rather than ecological output. The ash is grown, it's thinned and harvested, and the farmer is getting 2 crops out of the system. It's getting its livestock and the grass, but it's also getting an ash crop at the end. And then finally, at the other end of the spectrum, we can look at stock being introduced into wooded areas. So either farm woodlands, any time that we're bringing stock onto the farm woodland, that is another form of agroforestry system. So I hope those show you that there are lots of forms. And if we think about different arrangements of trees, depending on where you farm and how you farm, certainly the arrangement in the middle is a very common feature in many parts of Wales. Breaks down a little bit up as we go into the uplands. But we can see that many fields will have boundary planting, be it as hedgerows with standards, or with shelter belt systems. We do have parkland areas of more open scrub, where we retain trees. And we have, I guess, a more limited number of clumping or strip designs or woodlot designs. Okay, all of them are possible. Some of them perhaps fit better into a Welsh context than others. But there's a wide variety of different ways that we can think about what agroforestry might be. From a scientific perspective, one of the major reasons why people are interested in agroforestry is because of perceived benefits in terms of the efficiency of the system. So what you've got there in that top visual, it's not mine, so apologies for the colors, but if you've got basically an agricultural system, so we're looking at wheat and walnut here. This is from an experiment done in France by Montpellier University. So we've got wheat, which is growing so along the bottom, and you've got of the graph, you've got time in years. So over a 40-year period, you can see the area of red showing that the wheat is using about 20% of the sunlight. If we look at the forest crop separate from the wheat, we can see that over a period of time, as the trees are growing, they're using incrementally more light than the crop. Once you bring them together, though, what you see is that there's even more of the area of the land more area of the graph is shaded. So as the trees grow alongside the graph, there is the wheat, there is a slightly negative impact on the wheat and a slight negative impact on the trees. They both interact with each other. But basically, you're able to use more of the light than either system on their own. So if you combine them carefully and with careful design and management, you can bring about, you can get higher gains than you can between either of those systems alone. Okay, now that's using a very much what we call a silval arable system. So these are arable systems. It's not necessarily very appropriate for Wales in most cases, but it exhibits what we're at, and basically would also work, same principles work in shelter systems and in hedgerow systems. So let's think about why this might be important and in a Welsh context. So I talked about silver arable a second ago. In Wales, as I'm sure you're all aware, we're probably much more interested in growing livestock. And we call those types of systems, and many of the photo images that I showed you before were of silver pasture. So silvo, the word for wood, and pasture, so wood and pasture combined. And again, that has many different manifestations. We can think about forest grazing, trees retained in pasture to provide fodder, or trees, shelter belt systems where we're looking at shade. And if we think about the UK on its own, this is by far the most common form of agroforestry. So there was a fairly recent study, actually I've got my dates wrong, it was in 2017, not 2016, which demonstrated that just over 500,000 hectares of the UK is in some form of silver pasture. Okay, unfortunately in that study they didn't break it down, so I can't tell you exactly what the Welsh contribution to that is, but it is pretty present, and that was just looking at silver pasture. It didn't include hedgerow systems, which are related. So there is even more if we bring in hedgerows. It's globally, it's seen as a very, very important system. We've got a large area of the planet where we're growing livestock, and the integration of trees onto farmed land is seen as a major mechanism by which we can address climate change, and is seen as, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Project Drawdown, but it's a study done by Americans globally looking at all sorts of different methods which we can address climate change, looking at refrigeration, the way we generate electricity, buildings, etc. And silver pasture is identified within that program as 9 out of 100 different strategies for reducing our climate change. So it's seen as very important. If we think about the challenges of growing livestock in Wales, this may be a slight simplification, but in general, it's about maintaining the energy balance of the livestock and their welfare. And if we're careful in our design and we put trees in the right place and the right combinations of trees, then that green infrastructure can help maintain the energy balance of our livestock and contribute to their welfare. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes going through that in a little bit more detail. So what I've got here is some slides that I've borrowed from my friends in Coed Cymru. And this is from a handout you can download from their website. And what I think these slides do very well is demonstrate what we're trying to achieve with a shelter belt system. One of the things that we are very aware of is that as livestock get cold, or as they get hot indeed, they are putting energy into keeping themselves warm. So if we can reduce the stress that the livestock are under by thinking carefully about our shelter infrastructure, then we are saving pounds, because those livestock are still are maintaining their energy in growth rather than in keeping warm. And so if we look at modern designs for shelter belt systems, you'll see these multi-strata systems where we have shrub layers, hedgerow layers, and tree layers. And the higher you can build the system, effectively, the bigger the effect is. But obviously there are trade-offs in doing that. But you also importantly want to keep the system porous. We don't want there to be a full block. What we're really looking for is the wind to slow as it moves through the canopy. And where we've done studies, and we haven't, to be honest, done enough studies in the UK, but certainly in Australia and New Zealand, where they've had a long experience of using these, we can see we get quite significant live weight gains for sheep with good shelter infrastructure. And I suspect it's more than that. Importantly, obviously, at key periods in an animal's life, particularly at birth, where we're seeing high lamb mortality, where you've got good shelter infrastructure in place, you reduce losses almost immediately. Okay, and this is just in a normal year. If we add in an extreme weather year, and as I'm sure you're all aware, we're seeing more and more of those, the roles that a good shelter belt can do can be significant in saving, substantial numbers of stock's lives. It can move beyond just live weight gains, it's actually reducing mortality rates. So the science of that, and you may have seen Bangor's sheep that we take to the Royal Welsh, and probably the best way that I know for me to get leaflets out to people is to carry them one under each arm, and people will always talk to you. But basically, if we look at what that science is telling us, and if we look at this graph here, what we've got here is a green zone, which is where the animal is comfortable. And if we go into the red, where things are too hot, or if we go into the blue, where things are too cold, then the animal is effectively losing money for us. It's not growing at the rate that it has. And so what we hope by putting tree infrastructure in here is that by protecting the tree, by allowing the stock to have the shelter, and if you look at how stock behave near trees during those conditions, they will use the shelter, we can bring them into that positive zone. Okay, so this is a sort of an indirect economic benefit of having good shelter infrastructure in place. And you can get that with a hedgerow. It's not a big effect with a hedgerow, but if you put in a shelter belt system, you can do more. But we have to fit these into the context in which we're working. So that's, in some senses, the proof is already in the pudding in Wales. I can already go now and see on many farms shelter infrastructure, some of it well designed, probably some of it a little bit old fashioned, but it's there and it's something we know about. Agroforestry moves on. I work a lot with international students. I bring them to Wales, and they're always completely mystified when I show them henvice as to why we don't spend our time feeding our stock more trees, because farmers everywhere else in the world do feed their livestock tree fodder. And as we know, we used to do a lot more with tree hay in the past, particularly with elm and ash, unfortunately. But fodder trees are something that we traditionally have done, and old pollards from across the country are examples of us doing exactly that. But increasingly now we're interested in returning and looking at tree fodder again, and there's been quite a lot of recent research looking at the role that trees might play in addressing micronutrient deficiency, for example. Tree fodders have anti-parasitic properties, but also, pretty excitingly, if you feed the right fodder to livestock at the right time, they can inhibit methogenic bacteria in the livestock's gut, and that has potential to reduce the amount of methane that they produce. Okay, so that gets people quite excited, because as we move towards more climate smart agricultural systems, tree fodder may play an important role in helping to reduce that footprint that some pasture livestock systems have. So that's a sort of a new and emergent way for us to think about trees. Change. It's change, again, built on an old farming system before the science was present. So an old farming idea that we're revisiting and re-looking at and seeing how it can be used. But if we look more broadly, there are a whole range of things. And of course, you will start to perhaps see my bias here. I'll try and balance it up. But trees can provide a whole range of different benefits on farm. And I've grouped these. You'll see I've listed them. I won't go through all of them, but I've put beside them private good and public good. And that's important. So what private good does have an academic meaning, but I'm meaning it for this presentation to mean really a benefit that's realized primarily by the farmer, by the landowner. And a public good would be a good that leaks off the farm and provides benefits not only on farm, but off farm as well. Okay, and that's something that I'll come back to in a second. So if we go down through this, I can see already that I probably have made a couple of minor errors here. We could discuss this if you want. So biosecurity on farms, having a tree, having a boundary hedge between your land and your neighbor's land stops nose-to-nose contact with the stock, reduces incidences of disease. So farmers are often quite open to the idea of using trees as barriers on certain parts of the land. There's the carbon sequestration element, which is a public good. There's water regulation. So by water regulation, I mean both keeping water clean, but also the flow rates of water. And that is both a private and a public good. If I go onto a farm and talk to a farmer about flooding, particularly in the uplands, they'll go, well, it doesn't flood here. But they still, if you talk further, everything they're doing is about the management of water. And we run our vehicles up through hedgerows because we know hedgerows can handle it, whereas we drive across the middle of the field, we'll start to see erosion occurring. Those tree roots are changing what's happening with the water in the soil, and they're an important part of the way that we manage our farm. Okay, biodiversity, heat stress, biodiversity, public and private good, heat stress, provision of food and fiber and fuel, if you're interested in that sort of thing, reduce pest incidences in some cases, increase pollination, which may be important for some farms, high cultural value. The way we manage our hedgerows is often how we value our farming systems, or how others see the value of our farming systems. So trees also have an important role in the cultural value of the farm alongside some of these other benefits. But it's not all good. As I highlighted in that picture from France, there are trade-offs. Once your sward gets too close to a tree, particularly as the tree is developing, you may see some losses in productivity from the grass. I would probably argue that those are offset by the benefits that the trees are providing, but nonetheless, we do see losses in production. Trees can host pests as well as nice pollinators, so it's not always the case that the trees are necessarily brilliant for stock, but again, with careful design, you can manage that. Probably more importantly is the sort of practicalities. Managing trees takes time and knowledge, and I'll come back to that. And we need to be careful about getting the right tree in the right place, because it's a big cost to everybody if we've got the wrong tree in the wrong place. I'll think about these as we come back to it, but I think in terms of the agroforestry debate, I mean, I've made the case tonight that agroforestry has come from the farming community, but at the moment it's come back on the agenda from outside of the farming community. And the reason why I wanted to have those public and private goods is because if we look at different actors who are interested in what's happening within the rural sector, certainly from a policy perspective, you can see some of the arguments with agroforestry are directly related to how we respond to climate change. So we've talked about climate regulation. So, and that's that is really seen as really important to the fact that trees sequester carbon is valuable. But that only works with the right tree, again, in the right place. But we've also struggled over the last 2 or 3 years with more extreme weather than we're used to, and trees will play an important role in how we adapt to a changing climate as well. And to my mind, that's as important as the sequestration function that trees play. Trees are also very important from the policy perspective because of the fact that they can deliver these public goods. So if we set up a landscape full of hedgerows, then we get these flood risk benefits, we get these pollination benefits, we get these biodiversity benefits, and those are attractive from a societal point of view. Something that the farming sector can deliver to wider society alongside the food that we need for eating. More broadly than the policy sector, and part of what I'm doing in relation to my work in the tropics is we're looking at how farming is changing. We've used conventional farming, we benefited from the Green Revolution, but we're now also starting to see some of the costs of that development, and we're looking at new ways of farming. So you will probably be familiar with words like agroecology, and agroforestry is very important in the agroecological literature, particularly around soil health. So I'm not going to dwell too long on carbon, but it is an important conversation. It's a particularly important conversation now because a lot of discussions in the UK are using carbon as a mechanism for encouraging farmers to think about trees on land. And there is a robust evidence base that underpins that. There was a report published last year, by the International Panel on Climate Change. They did a special report on climate change and land. And the figure that I've got there comes from that. And it highlighted agroforestry as being one of the most cost-effective response options that we can implement without changing the characteristics of land, the farming system. So we can build agroforestry into our farming systems and keep them effectively functioning as farming systems rather than transforming them into other things. And agroforestry is seen within that study globally as a really important response option. Okay, and there are a number of other studies which all can pull out very large numbers for each of us to think about, showing how huge these things are. But I think most people are reasonably comfortable with the ideas that trees sequester carbon. It does vary in different contexts, as I keep saying, but they're obviously important. My interest is probably more from the soil health dimension. We know that trees are really important for maintaining long-term soil fertility. That's very, very clear in tropical systems, but it is clear also in Welsh systems. Trees have deeper rooting systems than grasses, so they're able to scavenge nutrients below ground. It's one of the reasons why they tend to be more robust during drought periods. They can access water and nutrients because they invest in their mycorrhizal associations. And as a result, one of the reasons why we like tree fodder and tree hay is because traditionally we use those systems to help us get through drought periods. Trees are good at reducing compaction. So we've done lots of studies at Henvice where we have trees and combine them with sheep and look at how poaching is alleviated by grazing around in amongst trees. And we know that trees are very good at helping with the soil water holding capacity and nutrient flows. So that they're valuable parts of the system in terms of restoration. Probably more commonly understood is that they are massively important for reducing soil loss. Soil loss is something that we don't think about very often. But from an academic point of view and a researching point of view, we used to measure soil erosion all the time. We don't do it very much anymore, but every time we do, we scare ourselves, so we stop again because it's very high. And we need to think carefully about soil loss. And trees are wonderful tools. They're not the only tool, but they are wonderful tools for reducing soil erosion. Okay, and of course they encourage things like earthworms and other, so it's not just the above ground biodiversity, probably as important, if not more important, is the role that trees play for the below ground biodiversity. And if you get the right tree, you'll get you can have a nitrogen fixer, which will reduce your fertilizer inputs completely. And again, that's from an agroecological point of view, that's a real big plus. So I have a quick definition, which I added in here. This is just building on what I've said. So we talked about what agroforestry is as a set of practices, but agroforestry is a little bit more than that. It's actually a natural resource management system that works through the integration of trees on farms for increased social, economic, and environmental benefit for land users at all levels. Okay, so not just the farmers, but also at a policy level. Okay, so that's the pros. I'm now going to think a little bit about what's limiting us from wider adoption of agroforestry in Wales, and of course that's a really important issue. We can't just look at the good things; we've got to look at the bad things as well. And I think the obvious and most important one is the economics, the economic barriers. So one of the big problems is we don't have a lot of detailed studies looking at the economics for farmers. And of course, if an agroforestry system is going to be uneconomic for a farmer, then that's going to present a fundamental barrier to the adoption of those systems. Okay, now we can make the case for different types of farming systems, those economic thresholds will change, but certainly we need to have better information to help farmers make decisions. If we look at other real concerns, establishment, fencing, all cost money, not cheap. And that's a real potential barrier to establishment. But there are other, I talked about perceptions of competition between grassland and crops, depending if you're talking to an old boy or not. All the Welsh farmers, I'm sure, are very reluctant to lose a metre of grass by any new tree establishment, but I would argue that the trees are balancing that loss by providing other benefits. So some of these concerns are very real. Other concerns just require better information to help us work through them. Of course, historically, we've had very different policy, and we're undergoing changes in policy at this present moment in terms of how policy thinks about the establishment of trees, and farmers certainly have been penalised for having too many trees. It's only very recently we've been looking at the 100 trees per hectare type scenarios, and of course those can create concerns. So you need to have an enabling policy environment, and of course there are certain farming systems, particularly tenanted systems, where ownership of the tree or user rights around relation to the tree can make this more complicated. Other barriers, because agroforestry is seen as complex, hopefully I've demystified that a little bit tonight, in that I suspect many farmers are agroforesters without realizing it. But there is, certainly if we're thinking about new systems or new designs, and one of the things I was hoping to have tonight, and hope you will spend time looking at, is the video that Garrett was talking about, because that is just a beautiful example of a farmer coming up with a design effectively on his own, and building that up, showing you what you can do. So nice original thinking, and I love it. But farmers see that a lack of skills and knowledge as being important. These are my perceptions, obviously. You can correct me. I've obviously spent a lot of time detailing those benefits, but I think there is still some unclarity about the nature of those benefits to the farming system. I think there are real issues around the level of policy support agroforestry has. It falls between a rock and a hard place in that it's not seen as agriculture or as forestry, so it sits somewhere in the middle, unfortunately, and there aren't very many people like me in the world, so it's in a bit of a grey spot, and that doesn't help with introducing more agroforestry. And finally, and I think, again, something we can discuss if you wish, is that it can run sort of counter some of our cultural values. We traditionally have cleared land of trees to make space for agriculture, and that thinking in various forms still persists to this day. And I would argue that many people wouldn't see hedgerows, for example, as agroforestry practices, but they meet the criteria, they meet the definition that I provided. So farmers are often more worried about alley cropping or row systems that we were talking about, rather than thinking about what sort of more, let's say, practically oriented, or there's a beautiful row system in the video that hopefully you can watch. There's this idea that we focus on the core business model in Wales, and that's about getting the grass growth right, and that's our focus, which means that sometimes we maybe take our eyes off the other benefits, so the shelter, and if we look across farms in Wales, it's easy to see areas where management has perhaps become a little amiss, and those hedgerows are no longer providing all the benefits they could do. And also, we've looked at shelter belts in the past, so we've used conifer designs, for example, and farmers are still potentially interested in those, despite the fact that nowadays we would suggest that the mechanism isn't as efficient as more modern designs. So there are all sorts of things that feed into the decision-making process that farmers are involved with, and that can affect their ability to uptake. So I was involved with the Soil Association and the Woodland Trust in developing a handbook for farmers, a guidebook, and there's a link there underneath the image. It was published last year, and it's been downloaded quite a few times. Hopefully not just preaching to the converted. I hope it's reaching out to farmers who are potentially interested in the system. And if you haven't seen it, please have a look at it. It's free. Let us know what you think. We certainly have had some feedback already, many positive feedback from farmers, with lots of farmers saying that it's helped them to make a decision to think about doing agroforestry. Does need more financial modelling, and farmers are very keen that we provide more information on knowledge exchange. So I'm just going to finish now the last part of my talk. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but just talking about what I see as the future of agroforestry in Wales. So this is very much a personal perspective, but I'm going to broaden it beyond Wales. And I'm going to talk about change more than anything else. And it's something that academically is what I'm very interested in, this process of change. And, in the image here, we've got a farming system in Wales. It looks a little bit different from many farms in Wales, but hopefully not too different. So we're looking at a dairy system where we have a lot of shelter infrastructure, and we're looking at a hedgerow in the foreground, which rather than being made up of 1 or 2 species is about 16 or 17 species. And it just shows us that other things are possible. And why do we want to think about other things being possible? I like having examples of things to look at and experiences to share, but I think the point that I want to make is that we are at a point of change. We are having this meeting online today because of COVID. We are talking about the National Forest for Wales because of climate change, and of course, I'm sure at the back of all our minds we haven't forgotten that we have that wonderful thing called Brexit arriving around the corner. And if we look at Brexit, and so this is some of the Welsh Government modelling, looking at what happens under Brexit. You can see in this picture here, don't worry too much about the details. There's a link there if you are interested and you haven't seen it. But basically what you've got is anything that's in green in those pictures is changing farming practice. So farmers going from one form of farming into another. And anything in orange is showing potentially people moving out of farming. Okay, so within these systems, and I'm sure you're aware, seeing changes in our farming systems. So change is happening all the time. And we need to adapt our farming systems to address that change. My work that I do in the tropics is primarily involved with what happens with climate change. It's a very real phenomenon, and we need to help farmers to adapt their farming systems to provide resilience to those systems. Similarly in Wales, agroforestry may have a role in helping stabilize these systems or feeding in to these new systems as farmers move across. Of course, the debate goes beyond just what the farming community thinks. If we think about those orange areas, others are thinking about, and it's an important part of the conversation that we think about the role that other forms of woodland systems, so the National Forest for Wales is very much thinking about expanding woodland cover in a range of different forms, and part of that will include plantation forestry. So these are just some very simple models looking at what land which is currently forested and what will happen if we were to put Sitka or Douglas fir on those systems. We can, so there's an active debate around the role of timber and both within farming systems and on other land types. And finally, some modelling that I wanted to show you from a colleague of mine, Ash Hardaker, who's doing his PhD with me in Bangor. And he's been looking at scenarios of tree cover change in Wales, where he's not just looked at he's looked at timber and woodland expansion, but he's also looked at various forms of other types of tree cover. And in his work, where he's been looking at economic modelling, he's showing that shelter belt systems are actually probably one of the very best forms of tree cover change that we can make. And his modelling included status quo. That this isn't how much money would be going into a farmer's pocket. It's an economic valuation looking at all of the benefits, those public and private goods, and thinking about those benefits, and identifying areas where they make a big difference, both to the farmer. He's thought about farmers and society, but in other areas. And in fact, in all of those three last images that I've shown you, we're looking at models. They're all based on incomplete data. They're not completely accurate records of what's happening. And this is another example of that. And if we were to have more detailed information, it might produce a very, very different picture. But what you can see from that is agroforestry, and this model here is actually, the reason why we have white areas on the map is because it was just looking at the uplands rather than the lowlands in this particular modeling exercise. But if we look across there, you can see areas where shelter belt systems make a lot of sense, and areas where shelter belt systems perhaps make less sense, okay, based on the data used in this model. On the ground, it could be a very different story, but it does show you that not everything works everywhere. So we need, again, to be careful when we're thinking about any form of tree cover change or any form of land use change, that we're not presenting a picture that everyone's going to benefit universally in the same way. But it's quite clear in this modelling exercise and for this modelling that agroforestry systems have a potentially important role, both for the farmer and for society within Wales. Something for us to think about. And so a lot of what we're doing here is thinking about change. When we talk about those cultural values, we find that we're often locked into different pathways as we farm, and in fact in all parts of life. So there's a theory around path dependency, that we're locked into certain paths, and anytime we introduce change, there's always going to be some reluctance to change. So agroforestry is simply one response to change. It's not the only response, and it's not going to work for everybody. But there is a growing interest in it, because not just in Wales, but globally, we have an increasing evidence bank which shows that in the right system, it's a win-win system. And if you design it carefully and you maintain it, which takes time and knowledge, then you can increase your productivity, diversify your systems, and start to restore, bring back some of that ecological complexity which we've lost in the recent years. Okay, I think in all of the conversations and in what I've presented today, what I'm trying to do is effectively demystify it. It's not something that requires anybody to make a massive change at any one point, you can introduce this change very gradually, and it builds on what's already there. So, in the first instance, it may just be looking at management of tree cover on the farm to make sure that it's delivering the best it can do for us. And if that was working, then thinking about a little bit more if that's going to be useful. It's not going to work for everybody the same everywhere. And this is exactly the same conversation that I have with farmers in the tropics. So this is a diagram. This is working with smallholder farming systems in Africa. These are the same conversations that I have with farmers there. We spend time looking at the soil health benefits, the water benefits, shade, fodder, fuel. Everything that I've talked about now is relevant within those farming systems. They're as interested as we are in livestock productivity, using the manure both for fuel. We don't do that so much anymore, but for soil fertility and feeding into their livelihood systems. Okay, and in many cases, just like in Wales, it's not the only thing that's feeding into the livelihood system as well. So if I go very quickly back and zoom out again, I showed you those maize fields in Vietnam. So the picture on the left here is looking at a response to those maize fields. And what you're looking there is two landowners. So on the right-hand side of that picture, you can see the open field still present. On the left-hand side, you've got that maize, but now growing with contour planting. So trees with shrub bunds there to hold that soil in place. And as you move further down the slope and getting to a pond there at the bottom, you've got fruit trees growing in orchards, which are grazed, and you've got aquaculture systems at the bottom. Okay, so the farmer there is adopting and modifying their systems to retain the soil, keep the soil on the land, and diversify their farming systems. In these systems, the market is the road. So that house in the foreground is right on a road. That's the market. You bring your produce, so you don't want to carry big heavy fruit from the top of the hill there. That's why those orchards are also down there at the bottom, because it's been designed to work within those farming systems. In the Comoros, which is just off West Africa, we've got agroforestry everywhere. It's an agroforestry island. It's an island that's undergone some of the most heavy deforestation in the world. Okay, and in those systems, it's very curious. If you're a farmer, they generally just have a field. You'll stake a cow in the middle of the field, and the hedgerows are fodder banks. You just cut the fodder, bring it to the cow in the middle of the field, and use the cow's fertilizer to manure, the manure to fertilize the field. So they're little princesses within those systems, and everybody cuts and carries fodder to them. Huge amount of knowledge about the role that trees play. The last picture is Ethiopia. What you've got there is a crop of teff, which is a sort of wheat-like crop, traditionally grown there, and a wonderful tree called Fferm albetha, which is interesting because it has what we call reverse phenology, in that it loses leaves when all the other trees are gaining their leaves, and has them when all they've lost them. So at the time when the teff needs to grow, the Fferm doesn't have its leaf in place, so it's not competing. As the teff needs shading from the sun, then it's in leaf, and so it creates a microclimate which is beneficial for the crop to grow. Okay, so those systems are great, easy wins. If we think about probably the biggest success story with agroforestry, and some of you may have heard of the Great Green Wall in the Sahel, the biggest and most successful agroforestry systems I know are what we call farmer managed natural regeneration, where farmers will grow trees on their farms, and we've got pastoralists grazing everywhere, so they'll grow the trees in thorns to allow the trees to grow, practice that we used to do here in the UK. And once those systems are established, you're seeing remarkable changes to the livelihoods. The microclimate changes completely. You have more water, and effectively these systems have become drought proof, and farmers are able to harvest and grow crops through extreme droughts. So we had some wonderful results from places like Niger, where the farming systems have gone from being completely drought prone and failing systems to being completely drought resistant. And it's simply by what microclimate that the trees are providing to the farming system, which has allowed them to increase yield. And these are significant. They don't require anybody like me to pass them on. The farmers talk to each other. In fact, in Mali recently, a colleague of mine found 40,000 hectares of new forest that nobody knew anything about, including the government, because the farmers were just talking to each other. So these are, again, back to farmer-led, farmer-designed systems that work, trees working on farm. So I'm just going to finish now. I think these are what I see as important, and you may agree or disagree with me, but I think in the UK, we still need to work a little bit more to provide farmers the sort of advice that they need to help them design systems that work. A lot of design has to be fitted to the context in which you're farming. So we're at a point now with whatever we do, there's elements of trial and error and experience that feed into those designs. We clearly need to provide farmers with better information on the economics to help them make decisions. You need a productive farm, and my strong belief is that trees can either provide that economics by providing a second crop, as we saw with the walnut, or as I'm trying to show in this picture here, again with a solitary tree, ideally a few more of them, working here as a little helper to stop becoming stressed and wasting energy, keeping themselves cool or hot, depending on the conditions we're growing in. So I've got 2 pages of conclusions. Agroforestry is an umbrella term. It means lots of different things. And I think there's maybe some miscommunication around what agroforestry is. So it's not particularly well known. It's increasingly well known now, but it actually, I think it means different things to different people. And I believe it's a relatively common feature of the UK landscape. I think many of you are agroforesters without realizing it. It's got a big wind to it. It's carbon. At this time, it's something that we need if we are to respond to climate change. So there's a very valuable role that it plays in terms of delivery of public goods, but it's often much more broad than just the carbon. There are a whole range of benefits that it provides. Putting trees on agricultural land will help to mitigate many of the negative sides of agriculture, soil loss in particular, but also water quality, air quality for certain types of systems. So we can use trees to reduce, around hen enclosures, chicken enclosures, to reduce the ammonia, offsets. But all of this needs to be done carefully, and if it's done carefully, then we can provide on-farm and off-farm benefits. But we probably need to work harder still, more people like Geraint, hopefully, to provide better decision support to farmers to help us to design and manage systems that work within the different contexts. And then everybody, not only the farmer, can benefit from these systems. So that's me done. I hope I haven't spoken too quickly or too long. Thank you very much.
That's excellent, Tim. Thank you very much. A lot of food for thought there, and plenty to think about. Thanks very much. We did try the film earlier on a test, and it wasn't very clear. What I am going to do now is try and run it again. If you could just come out of the presentation, please. That's it. And bear with me. So.
I'm Matt Swarbrick, and I'm lucky enough to be a farmer in northwest Wales between the sea and the mountains. And we're trying to prove that you can buy a small farm, that you can make it pay through producing food, but also you can build social capital by bringing people onto the farm, and also build biodiversity and soil at the same time. And I think if we can do all those things, then the future of small farming is super exciting. If you think of a farmer's job is to turn sunshine into food, and looking around our farm, one of the most productive spaces we have are those edge of woodland. It's so that woodland's just kind of fallen into the pasture. And so what I wanted to do was to maximise that all across the farm. It's kind of bringing in lots of this edge effect. And so what we've done over winter is we've divided up all our main pasture, the pasture around the house, into 30 individual day-sized grazing units. And we've done this using keyline design. We've done this essentially on north-south rows, so we still get maximum light penetration. And we've done it, been really careful to leave lots of space still for big machines and tractors and stuff to come through. And so it's not lost the ground, we've just added to it. On our poorer land, so on our north-facing land, we've put in alder, willow, bird cherry, hazel, things that are good for animals to browse, things that are quite fast-growing, things that are quite cheap to plant. And then on our better land, we've put in lots of top fruit. So we've put in apple and plum and cherry, mainly apple. And then we've also put in there lots of currants and gooseberries and elderflower and seed buckthorn, lots of other things actually. And we've also put lots of support species in. So we've got plants that are mining down for minerals, we've got plants that are fixing nitrogen, and we've got things that are bringing in beneficial insects. It's like a little mini ecosystem, like a linear forest garden running through the farm. Hembant's only a small farm, and so to make it pay, what we need is lots of layers of different enterprises. But in order not to go bonkers, those layers have to be quite simple and really efficient. So with the fruit trees, what we've done is we've put in mainly apple, and those apples are all designed, there's only 4 species, and they all ripen at a similar time of year, so we can come in, we can make fruit juice, and within a few weeks, we can be done with that enterprise. And also helps other projects. So actually now we've got the tree lanes, we can move the sheep and the cattle every day around the farm, and it only takes maybe, well, a few minutes really to move that livestock every day. So it's really good for pasture management as well. So financially, we've kept it super simple. So we've divided up probably most of this pasture for about £4,000. It's just semi-permanent electric fencing. It's really cheap to do. And what I'm hoping is in probably about 4 or 5 years' time, we'll start getting that income back every year on that. So we'll make more money with the fruit trees out of these fields than we ever would do with the sheep and the cattle. But then also, we've still got that income from the sheep and the cattle. In fact, we might even get more because we've got all those benefits of shelter and shade and increased moisture retention, and also the diversity that's coming off them eating those browsable tree rows. If you want to do agroforestry yourself, do it. It's really good. Speak to Farming Connect. You can speak to me. I'm one of their mentors. But I think it's a super thing to be doing.
So do I.
Yeah, excellent, brilliant. I'm glad that worked. I think it worked. I hope everybody was able to see and hear it. If you have any questions, please put them in to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, please. There have been a couple that have come in. I'll start with the first one, Tim. With regards to barriers, you were talking about agroforestry. Do you think that the word agroforestry itself needs to change for to incorporate a new way of thinking, or a new way of as part of an education for people to undertake and look at silvopasture systems, etc.? Or is that not the case?
It's something that I've thought about a lot. So I'm the chair of the Farm Woodland Forum, which is a UK level, effectively a group that's interested in agroforestry. It's for farmers and for academics, and we don't use the word agroforestry in our title. And I suspect that's because we don't necessarily think that the word agroforestry is inviting. I like the word agroforestry for my job because I think it describes what I call the technical science of thinking in the way that trees provide benefit on farms. But I think if I go and speak to a farmer in any different context, we'll have names like shelter belts, hedgerows, orchards, all of the practices that we see will all have different names that we can work with. So I do sort of distinguish between the sort of technical definition and technical use that I use it here. And I suspect that's a policy use as well. And the way that I would communicate with a farmer, I probably wouldn't use the word agroforestry at all if I could help it. I am divided on that one. I don't like the term myself. I think it would be nice to have a term that was different from that. But I do think it works in certain contexts. So I've wriggled out of that answering that one.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Next question. With the future policy and the changes that Welsh Government are looking at, but also Farm Connect are working on trialling, etc., in reduction of use of fertilisers in the future. How big a role or does nitrogen fixing species have to play within a system like that, and in reducing fertilizer, but planting on an agroforestry system, nitrogen fixing trees?
So, I mean, that's a really good question. It's going to, it's very difficult to talk about this without thinking about the context in which we're working. So, for example, at Henvice, we did an experiment for 20 years in reality, where we looked at planting a range of different trees in a number of different arrangements. And one of the experiments was using alder. Now, we use red alder, which is a non-native alder, because it's a nitrogen fixer. And in the pasture where we were grazing the trees with livestock, we didn't need to put any fertilizer on those systems. Whereas in all the other agroforestry systems we were working with, we did apply fertilizer to keep the sward length at the right height. So those row systems, I'm not entirely sure that most farmers would want to take a system like that necessarily, but it certainly is viable on some farming systems. And in those systems, I would imagine it makes a significant reduction in cost. If we were to look at upland systems with thinner soils, having the right trees with the right nitrogen fixing properties, I think it could have an effect. But it's one of these conversations I have also with farmers in Africa, when we talk about the value of tree, the trees are scavenging nutrients with their mycorrhizae. Those are coming into the leaves, and as the leaf mulch falls on the ground, they're refertilizing it. And the farmers see that as valuable. So valuable in Africa that they bury it, because in Africa, the wind is another man's fertilizer provider. And the mulch will move from land to land. So in certain systems, it will work. It will provide a significant benefit. In others, I suspect it will be slightly less.
Okay.
We have other clover systems, other grass. We can play with the sward. We're not reliant just on the trees for that function.
Okay. You spoke about tree fodder and tree hay. And it's a practical question, this, regarding legislation. Does it breach cross-compliance to cut tree fodder from March to September?
Oh, that's a great question. Right, that's a good question. I expect if I was going to be brutally honest with you, I don't necessarily know the answer. What I would say is there are a number of people on Twitter who are playing with tree hay across the UK at this moment. It's quite an active topic. There are certainly farmers that I'm following in England and Scotland who are quite happily harvesting tree fodder right now. So if they're breaking cross-compliance, they're breaking cross-compliance. So I certainly know the practice is going on. I suspect if you're able and allowed to flail your hedge, then you're not going to be in breach of cross-compliance. I'm afraid to say I would probably defer to somebody there who's got stronger legal knowledge than I do. My personal experience is that people are definitely gathering tree hay now.
Yeah.
Whether they're naughty or not, I'm not sure.
Well, I'd say probably they are. I'll just add a little bit to that. Definitely, if you're in an agri-environment scheme, Glastir, Uwch, the higher level Glastir, in the small print, you will find that you are not supposed to cut back any tree branches, or similarly with the hedgerows. So that it's obviously an issue there. And similarly, farmers are not supposed to cut and flail hedges from March through to end of August, early September, 1st of September. So yeah, it's something. I suppose if you were thinking of doing it, you'd be planting specific species to meet that objective.
Yeah, so I mean,
you're putting it. So
you can put fodder banks into the middle of the fields. You use those as the rows, so that we're looking at row planting. You can have fodder systems. I'm a strong believer in engagement as well. I think that these are our traditional practices, and there are contexts where, the guidelines are there for good reasons, obviously, but they're not cast in stone. So this is somewhere where in relation to agroforestry, and I was talking about policy, we do have to work within the current policy, but that policy is something that can change. And I certainly think that some of the benefits of tree hay may help us to make or help develop systems that allow us to do this type of activity. So I hope we can move towards it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm believe it or not, I'm a big fan of gorse in hedgerows, especially in the uplands. I think in the right place. But just came across a couple of facts about it that I had heard about before. But they're using gorse as fodder for cattle in the winter because of the protein content. I think it was 1847. There's a record of 80% of Welsh farmers were using gorse as a fodder or as an add-on in their fodder stores. Not so long time ago, but the fact is there, and also sown because it's nitrogen fixing. They were sowing it. So there are species out there that you can use, and I was thinking of small-eared lime maybe, or yeah, in these systems where you get an abundance. But I think obviously the bird nesting season and breach of legislation, I'd have to be very careful about that.
Yeah, you wouldn't want anybody's breach legislation.
If there are no other questions that have come in, if anybody wants to ask a question, please do so. With that, I'll thank you once again, Tim. It's been an excellent talk. I'm sure everybody's thoroughly enjoyed it, and we will draw it to a close. Thank you very much. Stay safe, everybody, and hopefully hear from you soon.